Thank you. Thank you for giving me the time to come here today. I had some slides, but I don't know if you can get them. But whilst the slides are being found, I can start talking. Of course, we're a Danish think tank, we're an independent Danish climate think tank, and I of course talk from a position of privilege, because we have a climate tax. We're going to have a climate tax on the emissions of agriculture by 2030. We are small, we're a rich country, we have a very consolidated agricultural sector. What in Denmark is a small farm is, in a European context, a large farm. We have a lot of data on all our farms. We have a lot of historic data. It was already presented, those facts. So of course, I come from a position of privilege. But one thing I'd like to say is that, or my encouragement is to try to accelerate the point where we actually cross the threshold, where we get to the point where we actually implement the things that are needed for agriculture to move on. Because I've followed this debate in Denmark for the last 4-6 years about agriculture, and as long as you're in the space where you're discussing things, there will be a lot of boogeymen presented, there will be a lot of uncertainty, but as soon as you get to the point where you actually start implementing policies, things start to consolidate. Things start to become clearer, also to the farmers, because to Danish farmers today, it's a lot more concrete than it was 2 years ago. And I'm sure that it's not something that's grown in their own garden, it's not something they wished for, that they had a carbon tax, but now today, they can actually see what they're going to expect. They can actually start planning to what they're going to expect, and they start looking for the solutions that reduce their emissions. Because before you reach that point, before you get those policies, you are in a limbo, which creates a lot of uncertainty, which creates a lot of protests, really. So my encouragement would really be to move forward to that point. But I was actually going to talk about on the Trinomics report, which we have actually looked into, which is great work by you, and we are very impressed with what you have achieved, and we very much support the idea of an ETS, and I can only repeat what Jeroen also said, that very much in agreement with most of the things that you said, that it's very important that we actually create a solution space, that we create a space that involves the farmers in trying to make those solutions. And there's no silver bullet for farming. But then again, I was in the energy sector for many years, and if we look back 10, 15 years, there was no silver bullet in the energy sector. If we look at the energy sector now, it seems obvious what the solutions are. We have solar, we have wind, it's cheap, batteries are coming. But if we go back 10 and 15 years, the energy sector looked at this problem and they said, how can we ever? We need our coal plants, we need our natural gas plants. The same will happen to agriculture as soon as we start creating a solution space, as soon as we face the farmers with incentives. And those incentives can of course be the carrot, but I also believe that the stick will definitely have to be involved in that aspect. I'm now going to rush fast. I think I was only given 6 minutes. I've probably already eaten quite a lot of that. But can I move forward? No. Click. Yeah. Yes. So, yeah, it's been said before, few emissions in agriculture, and a cap, as our own studies show, have proven ineffective at reducing agricultural emissions. But that's maybe not saying that a cap needs to reduce agricultural emissions, because there are many wishes, many desires for the agriculture, organic farming, regenerative farming, and maybe that is the purpose of the cap, of supporting these things. Maybe we need something else to reduce emissions. And the question that you should keep in top of your mind is, when someone talks about agriculture, you need to focus on how will what you're saying reduce carbon emissions. Because when it comes to agriculture, we often get distracted by other things. And those are not unimportant things, but we get distracted by things such as life in the countryside or biodiversity. And those are important things, and we need policies that support these things. But when we're talking about carbon reductions, we need to focus on how will what you're proposing reduce carbon emissions. And sometimes we tend to forget that when we talk about it. So we looked at the Trinomics works, and we very much ended up in the same point as Jeroen described in the downstream model. The problem that we have very many farmers in the EU, I think I've heard a number of 9 million. So 9 million actors working with an ETS, that's not going to happen. That's where the downstream model, where it's dairy, the producers, the meat, dairy processors, will be the main carriers of that. But then, and I'm going to do it slightly quickly, I'm going to jump, I've mentioned the solution space, we need to create a link between the processors and the farmers. We need a middleman who can ensure that the farmers get the benefit in an ETS. Effectively, we can see three pathways of how reductions are going to come about. One of them is, of course, we introduce an increased cost on producing high emission foods. That will reduce demand. But actually, what our study shows that even with a high tax in Denmark, it has very little effect on the consumers. It's mostly a boogeyman. The consequences of a carbon tax in agriculture is fairly limited. Then, of course, we can have Danone, Nestlé, and others who can try increasingly doing hybrid products. So not just a dairy product, but maybe a dairy product with a bit of plant. That's pathway number 2. But very important is that with a downstream model, which is probably the only realistic model, we need somehow for the farmers to see the benefits. We need to have clear incentives, clear value, so that small farmers aren't forced to be negotiating with Nestlé in terms of how much they're going to get for what they provide. We need a relatively clear framework of deductions for farmers and compensation so they can see the advantages of entering into these things. I think I'm about to use my time, so I'm quickly going to go forward. We need a cap which doesn't necessarily reduce emissions, but certainly which doesn't work in the opposite direction of an ETS. We need the revenues from an ETS going back to the farm sector. We need a focus on other environmental objectives, but they don't need to distract us from the purpose of reducing our emissions. That's it for now. But if you have any questions, you're welcome to come and ask me.